You're listening to The Invisible Addiction, a podcast investigating problem gambling. And I just sort of said to myself, well, this is it. I'm going to go and win it all, or I'm going to kill myself. Relapse is something that needs to be kind of talked about more and accepted a little bit more, but just the mental health impact, the speed of harm that happens in gambling is also something that needs to be looked at. I think it's important to say, one of the big observations that I've got of life, actually, not just recovery, is that nobody can do it alone. I believe that anyone is capable of doing it. I also believe it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of help, you know what I mean? But I just think there is hope for everyone.
Hello and welcome to a bonus episode of the Invisible Addiction podcast. We are joined today by special guest Chris Murphy, Darts Commentator and Sporting Chance Communications Manager. Sporting Chance is the world's leading charity providing mental health services to sports people and was founded by former Arsenal and England football captain Tony Adams. You might have seen a BBC Sport article this week in which he said that gambling addiction has become the biggest issue among professional sports people treated by the Sporting Chance Clinic. Their CEO Colin Bland went on to say that the relationship between sport and gambling has reached a pivotal point, labelling gambling addiction as a serious public health issue. I'm delighted that Chris has chosen to share his gambling addiction story with us and also chat about the statements made this week. If you'd like to connect with Chris, you can reach out to him on Twitter at chrismurphy180. If you'd like to get in touch with me, please email info@theinvisibleaddiction.com. Finally, please don't be shy to subscribe and leave a nice review of the podcast. It helps push us higher up in the mental health category and help reach people who might be struggling with their gambling. Right, it's time to hear from Chris. Enjoy! All right, so really pleased that Chris is on the other end of the line. Chris, firstly, how are you?
Yeah, good, thanks, Alex. How are you?
I'm not too bad. As I sort of just discussed, I'm a little bit nervous, but really excited that you've been able to join us for today's podcast. We're going to talk about your gambling addiction story, if we may, and then talk about Sporting Chance. But firstly, I don't know if you want to just tell the listeners maybe a little bit more about your background and experience.
Yeah, so of course I'll cover my gambling addiction story is kind of defining of my background really, but more recently I work as a darts commentator. I worked for a few years for a sports management company in a communications role. That actually came off the back of me going to university as a mature student when I first tried to stop gambling. Got a job there, ended up being the press officer for Michael van Gerwen and a few other professional darts players. And that was at the time when he was becoming the beast he is now, became world champion, became world number one. So that was a really interesting experience for me, but also a very lucky one that put me in a good position really to do what I wanted to do with my life. So I'm very fortunate in that way. But yeah, I work now as a darts commentator. I also have a communications role for the Players Association in darts, the PDPA, and also work for Sporting Chance as their communications manager, as well as a facilitator of gambling education.
Very nice, very nice. Well, I'm sure we'll kind of come on to the darts, and I don't know if that kind of comes into your gambling addiction story and the timeline of events and stuff, but could you perhaps spend some time now just telling us a little bit more about your gambling addiction story, how you got into gambling, and sort of, the timeline of events, as it were?
Yeah, absolutely. I placed my first bet when I was 17 years old, and I do have the kind of classic story of a winning bet first off. Simplistically, I could say that was what got me hooked, but I think there's much more to it than that, to be honest myself. But the facts are that I placed a £2 accumulator on a football match when I was 17, and I won 350 quid from that first bet. So I was at college at the time, went to the bookies because everything was still, in the bookies at that point, and collected the cash. The feeling of having that amount of cash in my hands, it doesn't actually seem like an awful lot of money these days, but then to a 17-year-old college student, I'd never seen that amount of money in my life. And actually, I became hooked very, very quickly. When I look back, sort of going back a few pages, when I look back at my childhood, I probably had the signs of somebody who was susceptible to addiction in childhood. I remember long nights not sleeping because I was playing Football Manager and things like that. Never want to eat one chocolate bar, always had to be 4. So I think there were lots of signs in there that maybe I was susceptible to some form of addiction later in life. And for me, it ended up being gambling. And yeah, I placed that first bet and I very quickly was addicted. Often people go through a kind of slow process. It can kind of be a slow and subtle deterioration, although less so now with online gambling, which I'm sure we'll come on to talk about. But for me, it was very quick, actually, to the point that I stopped going to college because I had that amount of money. I lost a sense of perspective. I lost the value of money very, very quickly, and got thrown out of college just before I was due to do my A-levels because I've just not been going. I've been going to the pubs, drinking, playing on fruit machines, spending the money that I'd won, trying to win more. And then I thought, well, that doesn't matter. I can get a job. And if I get a job, I'll get paid every week. And then I'll have money every week. And then I can gamble every week and drink every week. And it all seemed like a good idea until I started getting loans. It was around the time just before the financial crash, so when banks were throwing money at people. And on my 18th birthday, I phoned up the bank for a overdraft because I didn't have enough money to go out that night, and was sold a £2,500 loan. And for me, free money, I'll win it and replace it. Often the story with people with gambling addiction. Obviously didn't do that, and it just became a spiral of debt, continuously gambling. It's cutting a long story short, but I would say that I gambled just about every day for 6 years. And if I had thousands of pounds, because I had a bit of a good run, I would take thousands of pounds with me to the casino or to the bookies. If I didn't have anything, I would search down the back of the sofa to find 20p to put a bet on and accumulate that day, just so I had that bit of action, because I'd certainly become dependent on gambling. So that's a kind of story of when I was gambling all the time, which took me to my darkest day when I was 23 years old, so 6 years after my first bet. I owed a lot of people a lot of money, some of the wrong people, not just friends and financial institutions, but some people you don't really want to be owing money to as well. And the walls seemed to be closing in. Obviously, I'd gone through a severe struggle mentally with my mental health, although I didn't realise it at the time, because I was just keeping all this inside and sort of shouldered the burden. Yeah. And a couple of times, actually, I'd been to GA meetings. So I actually went to my first support group meeting when I was 18 because my mum identified that I had a problem. She sort of dragged me there, but I didn't really engage, didn't really believe that I was the same as the people in that room, that could happen to me.
I was going to say that's quite an early intervention, isn't it?
It is, yeah. My nan worked in betting shops, and actually when I placed the first bet, I phoned my nan to find out how much I'd won. And she gave me a really stark warning on that day, like, this is where it starts, don't go down this road. And I remember the conversation. So my mum was very aware of sort of, even though signs are difficult to look for in gambling addiction, of what could happen. And I think they were keeping quite a close eye on me and could see what was going on. My mum always wanted me to go to university and maybe could see a bit more potential in me than I was going to actually fulfill doing what I was doing. So yeah, it was an early intervention, and it must have been hell for her to see me not admit it myself for a long time. And then when I got to that age of 23 and it felt like the walls were closing in, felt like I'd let everybody down, felt like everybody else's life would be better if I wasn't around. But also, if I'm going to be brutally honest, I realised that I could not gamble. And the thought of living without gambling seemed to me at the time, because I'd become so dependent on this thing, I'd become so addicted to it, the thought of living without gambling seemed worse than the thought of dying. So I had a suicide attempt when I was 23 years old. Fortunately, it didn't work. And that's when I really started pursuing help myself.
I was going to say, lots of questions that have sprung to my mind. Yeah, I mean, it's never easy talking about, like, a suicide attempt and things like that. But if I could just go back one step, what sort of things were you gambling on? Was it a compulsion to gamble on everything, or was it just a couple of things that you were gambling on?
Yeah, good question. For me, it was, it started on football. That first accumulator was on football, but it very quickly progressed to things that I got that gave me what I needed, which were generally the fixed odds betting terminals and then casino games. Physically then, because online gambling wasn't really as prominent, and it wasn't really, even if it was available, it wasn't something I had access to, because by that time I'd kind of become blacklisted. So I only had like cash cards and things like that. I was only able to deal in cash, doing a lot of cash in hand work and things like that. So yeah, generally it would be roulette would be the big one back then. Slots later on down the line. I mean, I'll come on to talk about my experience since that point, because it hasn't been, a smooth ride. I'm not sitting here 11 years bet free or anything like that. But yeah, then I think it was the games that would give me the instant result, the instant fix. And if I could make the comparison to maybe somebody, and I know it's not always as linear as this, but to somebody who maybe starts drinking a little bit and then maybe smoking a bit of weed or something, and then goes through different phases and ends up on heroin or some class A drug that gives them that little instant hit that they need, I would really compare the way that I felt playing things like fixed odds betting terminals or going to the casino and playing roulette as very, very similar to that.
Wow. I mean, in my case, it was sort of, fixed odd betting terminals was the kind of the gateway, if you like, into it, and it was just like plugging yourself into the mains electricity. The way I think of it, like you've described, is it'd be like a heroin addict, sort of constantly just injecting themselves with this drug, and it was just, I was just so transfixed by it. So again, it's never easy talking about an attempt to take your own life. Are you okay to talk about that?
Yeah, of course.
Perhaps just talk us through what happened and your mindset and things like that.
Yeah, it's a bitter sweet story, really. There's an almost comical aspect to it as well, which makes it easier for me to talk about, I suppose, as well. On the day that it happened, all my friends, ironically, had gone to the races, and I hadn't gone because by then had a gambling problem. People knew I had a gambling problem by then. So I'd been doing things like pretending to go to GA meetings because it had all come. Sometimes you can get to points in life where honesty is the best policy, but I've done this sort of deceitful honesty that often people in addiction can do, which is say, look, I'm going to sort myself out, I'm going to get help, I'm going to stop gambling, and I'm going to tell everyone, and then I'd just go and gamble in a different town, or something like that. And I would pretend to go to GA meetings and go gambling instead and things like that. And all my friends had gone to hair.races. races. I'd not been invited because of my problem, yet there I was with, insurmountable problems piling up, not just the financial, as I said, but the mental health as well. And I just got to the point, on the last day, I almost did the ultimate gamble, is which when I had a certain amount of money available to me and a certain amount of money that I needed to win to pay off the most pressing debts. And I just sort of said to myself, well, this is it. I'm going to go and win it all, or I'm going to kill myself. So it really was that ultimate all or nothing. And that particular day, actually, I don't know how your sort of normal gambling day went, but usually I'd go up and down for quite a bit. Eventually it'd be, all gone. For me, it usually was all gone every time. Whatever I had access to, it would all go in that day's gambling. Yeah. But sometimes that would be 3 or 4 hours. Sometimes it might be 16 hours, before it had all disappeared. This particular day did not hit one winner, just everything just disappeared within like half an hour, 40 minutes. And I almost felt like, it was some sort of supernatural power telling me, yeah, actually, the best way out is suicide. You've been given that lesson. So I went back to the house I was sharing with some friends, and one of my friends took sleeping pills. I knew he took sleeping pills to get to sleep at night, and I actually went up to his bedroom, and first thing I saw was about £50 coins on the side, like he must have had a win on the fruit machine or something like that before. So the first thing I did was took them and went back to the bookies and lost them before I did it. And then I came back and took out of his drawer some tablets, which I believed to be sleeping tablets. I then walked up to the moors. I lived sort of in the hills in West Yorkshire, walked up there, sat on a bench, had a final sort of swig of beer and a cake or something, bizarrely, like some sort of last rites, and took these tablets and then just started walking around, sort of hoping that I'm just going to sort of collapse and they'll take effect and I'll die at some point. And it didn't really have any effect. And then I'd left a suicide note, and next door neighbour who we were quite close to at the time. Found it a bit strange that I'd not gone to the races, but I'd not been around at all. And they ended up going into our house and finding the suicide note and contacting my parents, who started driving around and looking for me, and actually found me just wandering the streets like aimlessly, waiting for these sort of pills to kick in. And it turned out that the pills that I'd taken weren't the pills I thought. I'd taken a load of hay fever tablets, it turned out. And the sort of comical side is that now I get really bad hay fever in the summer. So it's always a bit of a reminder, that like every time I have to take one of the tablets to stop myself getting really bad hay fever, it's always a bit of a reminder of that day and how I felt that day, which I don't think is a bad thing, to glance back. I don't dwell on it anymore, but I don't think it's a bad thing to have a reminder of where I've come from.
I was going to say, I mean, I found it quite uncomfortable listening to that. I mean, it's, yeah. Was that where, because I've watched the YouTube video that I think you did, correct me if I'm wrong, is it with the Northern Gambling Service? Is that?
Yes,
who you record it with? And is it located there? I think you go onto the
It is, yeah, but on the exact bench where I sat. Yeah, that's where we went that day, which was a strange experience because I don't live around there anymore. I burnt a lot of my bridges in that area. So I'm not really in contact with people there, and it was quite strange to go back there. That it was last year I think I filmed that, so it was about 9 years after the suicide attempt, and it was the first time I've been back to where it happened.
I was going to say your hair's got a lot longer since.
Yeah, it's been longer and shorter in the period in between.
You're going for the. I'm trying to think. Enter footballer's name. I'm trying to think. Paolo Maldini.
Yeah, well, he's a good-looking guy, so I'll take that one.
Oh, blimey! Yeah, I feel like this is. I don't know where to take the conversation, Chris. I mean, so what happened after the sort of suicide attempt, and can you sort of tell us what happened after?
So yeah, my parents took me home, and I was. I told them I'd taken something. They phoned up an NHS helpline, and I said they'd not had any effect. They were like, well, they can't be the pills that he thinks they are if they haven't had any effect, and basically was encouraged to throw up. And then if there's any more problems, take him to hospital. And then I sat and confessed everything really to my mum and my stepdad, and it was the first time I'd really been honest about everything. And the conversation was basically my mum saying time and time again for hours and hours, is there anything else? And there always was something else, another debt, another secret, and it just went on for a long time until everything was out in the open. And the next day I went to a support group meeting for the first time, off my own back. Like I wanted to go, I wanted to stop gambling. I basically, dying hadn't worked, if that makes sense. And I know that sounds horrible. Like I'm very grateful it hadn't worked, but like I was like, I can't live like this. I knew then that I couldn't on my own, with my mind in the way that it was or had become wired. I couldn't live without gambling. And I think sometimes it's difficult for people to understand how something that's not a substance that you ingest can have that effect on somebody. I think there's been a lot of research, and if people dug a little bit deeper, they would see exactly how that works. But I just knew that I couldn't live without gambling. So I had to do something to try and stop gambling, or at least try and change it, gamble normally, whatever it was. So I went to a meeting and started going about trying to stop. But also it became a pivotal moment as well, because it gave me a blank page, and it enabled me to say also, you can't live the way you're living, not just in terms of gambling, but in terms of everything. So if you're going to stick around, you've got an opportunity now to design your life the way you want it. So I did things like applied for university as a mature student, which did the exact same course that I would have done had I not been thrown out of my A-levels, 6 years earlier. So a lot of things changed for me on that day. Very, very grateful that it went wrong. Very grateful that I, took the wrong tablets. And I think sometimes your darkest day turns out to be the turning point. I think that's often a common theme. But I'm very, very sad and very, very sorry that a lot of people don't get that chance. A lot of people they do end up going through with it, or it ends up going the other way than it did for me. And because I know that you can come out the other side and create a life that you can fulfill your potential, it just makes me awfully sad to know that, people have been in the exact place that I was, but didn't get the chance to turn it around.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we can't forget all the people that are no longer with us for that exact same reason. It was the reason I started the podcast. Really, was in memory of Lee. So God bless him. God bless him, and everyone else that's has taken
definitely.
their own life. So you mentioned about GA, and I'm sort of quite surprised that obviously at 18 you were sort of, your mum suggested that you should go to the meetings and things like that. And as a person, myself, I've not been to a GA meeting. I somewhat feel a little bit guilty because obviously a lot of people like yourself have. But there's, everyone's recovery is unique and things. But I suppose just from my sort of naivety or I don't know what the word is, but yeah, naivety. Could you give us a bit of insight? What are GA meetings like? But
Yeah, I'm slightly reluctant, to be honest, to talk about GA specifically in isolation, just out of respect for the fellowship, because they've got their own sort of traditions and principles around anonymity and stuff like that. So I'm more than happy to say that I went to GA meetings. I've been to many, many kinds of support meetings. But what I will say is there is a huge therapeutic value in people who've been through similar experiences, sharing that experience, strength and hope, and helping each other and getting into a program of recovery to try and arrest what is a very, very difficult illness to overcome, the illness of addiction.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so if we could move the conversation on a little bit more, and so tell me a little bit more about your recovery. And I guess at this point, are we now? You said it was like, when was your suicide attempt? Was it 23? No.
Yeah, so 2010.
2010. So tell us more about sort of the years after that, or the years after that.
Yeah, so I went to meetings and got a little bit of help for depression. So I was doing things like CBT at the time as well through the NHS, and getting support from my family. Things like my mum looking after my money and things like that while I was at uni. And I went on a run of 18 months after that suicide attempt without gambling, but didn't really engage with. I didn't really get on with CBT for some reason. I didn't really engage with a program of recovery. As I said, I went to meetings, but didn't do much more than make it difficult for myself to gamble, I suppose. So I took away a lot of temptation. And I think there's a kind of shelf life for that way of recovery, or there certainly was for me. And after 18 months, I had my first relapse, and it was something as simple as my student loan got paid into my account couple of days earlier than we were expecting it to. So the plan had been to hand over my bank card to my mum like the day before it was going to come in, so that she could then take the money out and just leave me with enough to get through that term or that week or whatever stage we were at with that at the time. And I went to the bank one day, there was a lot of money in there. Straight away my head went, this is an opportunity to gamble, and just drew a lot of it out. Lost about half my student loan in that day in a local bookmakers playing on fixed terms betting terminals again. And in the period since then, what kept happening was I kept going back to meetings, kept doing the same things really, because I'd see that they'd been effective in that period, but the periods of abstinence started getting shorter and the periods of relapse kept getting more damaging. So all the time, the rest of my life, because even though right now I sit here just under 2 years bet-free, I've been bet-free for most of the last 10, but the relapses that I've had have been really damaging and caused a lot of problems, severe mental health problems, being close to suicide again at times through them, because actually they've almost felt worse than when I was gambling every day, because the rest of my life has sort of been getting itself together, and then I've been threatening that by the relapses, or the relapses were threatening that.
Yeah, I think I spoke to George Cooper recently, who was writing an article or doing some research about relapse, And forgive me, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, George. If you're listening, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But I think he was speaking to then Matt Gaskell, who said actually a relapse can be, just as harmful, if not more harmful than going back, as it were. I can't remember. I haven't quite got that phrasing correct, but basically, echoing everything that you've just said. How harmful a relapse can be.
Yeah, and I think it's probably the most common symptom of addiction, relapse. I think there can be sometimes an almost unrealistic picture. If this might not make sense, but just bear with me, there can be an unrealistic picture painted by real stories, because often the people that tell the stories publicly are the ones that stopped and stayed stopped from day one and are now 20 years free from gambling or 20 years free from drinking or what it might be. When actually most of the people that go to support groups or try and get help do relapse. Even yourself, Alex, how many times have you said, right, I'm going to stop gambling now, and then gambled? And that could be described as a relapse. That's effectively what it is. If you made a decision to stop and then gone against your own, decision to do that. So I think relapse is something that needs to be kind of talked about more and accepted a little bit more, because I often found myself going then back to meetings and feeling like I was some kind of failure, that I'd let the groups down, that, I was somehow more severely addicted than they were, more ill than they were, until it got to the point where I was like, you know what, maybe it's impossible for me to live life without gambling. And then I went to uni, I got a degree, I got a job, as I said before, with that sports management company, and started getting all the things in life that I wanted to, relationships, finances building up. And then every few months, bang, the rug gets pulled from under my feet through a relapse. Everything, my bank account emptied, depression that followed. By then I was gambling online, so it became even much easier, and it's much more dangerous. Like I know that some people will say different. It is. I've done both. Gambling online is much more dangerous than anything else that's ever been out there. Sometimes even me as an addict, who was probably one of the most severely afflicted addicts out there, who would go to great lengths to have a bet, sometimes having to make a massive effort to have a bet would be enough to put me off, because it would give me that period to pause. If you've got gambling access on your phone, on your laptop, and you've got access to your bank account at any time, it's very difficult to create the headspace to pause and not go ahead and do it. So the online gambling was certainly for me the most mentally and emotionally damaging.
Chris, what would trigger you?
Being happy, being sad, being hungry. What wouldn't would be a better question. I think the best way to answer that question is to say how I think I'm doing it now, which is by actually designing a life and living a life where I'm fulfilled most of the time, that I feel that I'm in line with my own sort of moral code and principles, that I'm living a life that's true to myself, and therefore don't feel those feelings of restlessness, irritability, all those things often enough to get urges. Like I've had very few urges in the last couple of years. And before that, just about every time I had an urge, I'd gamble. It just so happened that those urges came months apart, so I'd be gamble free in the time in between. Often the sort of back end of it, when it started getting really bad again, when the relapses were sort of happening every 2 or 3 months, and I was emptying my bank account and getting to a bit of a mess again. I was living on my own in a small flat, quite lonely. Felt quite isolated. Lived in a place where it was quite vibrant, a student area, Headingley in Leeds. So if I went out, I would see everyone else having fun and think life was kind of passing me by, and just wasn't happy. I wasn't happy at some aspects of my work. I wasn't happy with my home life. Absolutely felt, as I said, just quite isolated, quite lonely, and started sort of the gambling again. It just takes all that away. And I think this is something that doesn't get spoken about much as well, because we have to rightly talk about the effects of gambling and how dangerous it can be. But for the addict themselves, we're not stupid people. It gives us something. And all that I've just described, if someone said to me, well, do this and that will take all that away, then of course it's going to be a tempting proposition to do that. And many, many times I did do that. For me, actually, as I said, it was everything every time. So we may go on to talk about some of the sort of more, some of the stuff that's been in the news perhaps more lately. I never had, like, for example, a VIP scheme. I was never sort of lured in that way. So I never felt sort of groomed, as some people put it. But one of the reasons for that is because I knew I had a gambling problem for so long. I'm only talking, just 2 years ago that I was relapsing and doing all this online. I would go online, lose all my money with a betting operator, and then immediately self-exclude from that betting operator, because in that moment I never wanted to gamble again. So I never hung around on one website long enough to be sort of enticed by a VIP scheme or anything like that. So that was my experience. I'd just go to another one, which is why, in terms of regulation, that individual websites doing tools to help you stop is not enough. There has to be a really collective approach in that. But yeah, it was awful. It was 100 times worse than gambling every day. Honestly, the difference was I got suicidal thoughts many times, but by then I knew what to do about them. I was brave enough to phone up like the mental health crisis teams or the Samaritans or someone in that moment and talk it through with them. So I was very, very lucky.
I was going to say, would that, to anyone listening that is struggling with the gambling, is that the advice that you would give them to ring sort of helplines such as the ones that you've mentioned?
Yeah, I'm in terms of stopping gambling or sorting out your gambling, I'm a fan of anything that works. Different people have gone through different solutions, and I know what didn't work for me, and I know what is working for me now. But if you're in a crisis, it takes a lot of courage to speak to someone about it, and often it's very difficult to speak to people about it. I was kind of forced to the first time, but actually there's many, many wonderful charities or NHS helplines that are there, fully qualified people that are just there to help you, and a few times that's probably saved my life.
So Chris, you mentioned about online casino games that you were playing and things like that. Could you tell us a little bit more about the addictiveness of those games?
Yeah, for me, they were the most dangerous. I know I spoke before about fixed odds betting terminals and playing in casinos, but for me, bringing them into my pocket, into my front room, onto my toilet, in bed, a lot of the time, things like that, I think that's just really, really dangerous. I'm really pleased actually that things have developed in the last few years, like GamStop and GamBan, that have enabled to a large extent to take that temptation away. But the products themselves, I do think, and this is obviously a personal opinion, but I do think from my own experience and from the experience of other people that I've met a lot of, as you will have, Alex, people who've gone through this addiction. I think the products do really need looking at, because I don't know anyone that's ever played on them that has kind of been what you would call a normal gambler. And I don't know how I hear people from the industry talk about the fact that some people, or even most people, play slots online responsibly. But by that logic, when you consider that a slot machine, I'm being generous here, but it spins about every couple of seconds. And, if you're doing £1 a spin, which might be a pretty standard stake, then you're talking about someone losing a tenner in 20 seconds. If they lose every spin, if they lose only half the time, then it's a tenner in 40 seconds, if we're going to be generous. But like, if you're going to say that something like that is kind of a standard bet, if I think about my mates who gamble normally, they might have a tenner on the football or a tenner on a horse. If you think about that sort of amount of money going in that short amount of time, are the people that talk about this really suggesting that some people go and play slots for 20 seconds or 40 seconds and then just go off and get on with the rest of the day? Just doesn't seem like a realistic picture to me. And I'm not sure whether that's because kind of people are in denial about this, or whether it's that they're being a little bit disingenuous. I don't know the answer to that, but I really do think that there needs to be a lot of the features of these slots are very, very addictive. I got to the point where I wouldn't play anything but online slots because, they were the things that were fulfilling. They were exploiting all the addictive tendencies that live within me.
Yeah, definitely. Would you say that I don't know, I'm trying to. I spoke to Richard Flint, the former Sky Bet CEO, the other day, and I'm trying to remember what he said, but it was something along the lines of he didn't feel that those games created addiction, but he perhaps thought they exploited addiction. Or I want to be careful. I've got to be very careful with what I say, and I don't know if that is the correct phrase that he used. But would you agree that you felt as a person that has problems with gambling online, would you say that was exploiting you?
I think so, yeah. I think so. I think I would. I definitely heard that phrase. I listened to the podcast, obviously, Alex. And first of all, a lot of respect for Richard for coming on, and speaking to you. And I know that he's engaged often with people with gambling problems and that have suffered from gambling harm. So I respect him for that. And he knows that I have an issue around online slots. And he probably doesn't seem to be often. I think one of the big problems, and actually I'm talking about, I don't want to use this term, but I am going to use it because it's not a better one, but I'm talking about both sides here.
Yeah.
And I say I don't want to use both sides because I don't want it to be an adversarial thing. But often the detail gets lost because we just talk about online gambling. A lot of people assume online gambling to be putting a bet on a football match or just, a horse race or whatever it is. But actually, when you dig a little bit deeper, there are some products that are much, much more, I was going to say much more dangerous. Let's be even fairer than that. Let's be even more balanced. There are products that more harm is experienced on, more gambling harm is experienced on. And online slots are one of them. Basically, casino games that have been taken out of the casino and put onto your mobile phone. And there's a reason why casino games were in the casino in the first place. Now, I was able to self-exclude myself from all the casinos in Leeds, in fact, most of the casinos in the country, and I can't get in them. I've tried, believe me, I've tried, and it works.
Me too, yeah.
Yeah, and you've got to walk through the door, see the person, they've got to get your ID, and it's almost impossible to get in. And I know there are good things to do that with online gambling as well, but some of the products, I think, do definitely exploit addiction. People will say, the game designers will say, well, they're designed for repeat play. Well, that's what an addict wants to do, is keep repeating that behaviour. And it's an old-fashioned trick. It's nothing new. It's just been brought onto the modern platform of technology. But the fact that casinos are dark and there are no clocks in there, and it'll give you, drinks and free food when you're at the table, it's designed to encourage repeat players, they might call it. So yeah, I certainly think it does exploit addiction. There are certain features of a lot of these games: speed of play, stake limits, and things like bonus buys and all sorts of all the stuff that goes into them, very similar to apps that people play on for fun. Like a lot of slots these days look like Candy Crush looked 5-6 years ago. So I think they do really need looking at, and I think we need an adult conversation, actually. Again, I don't know whether the people that sort of say people play on these, I want to know what it looks like to play on these slots kind of safely, because I can sort of get the point if you're talking about a £25 jackpot fruit machine in a pub, but when you another thing is apparently you're not allowed to advertise large jackpots on slots. I heard that said on the podcast last week. Yeah, I went into the other room and turned on the TV, and there was an advert from one betting operator that was advertising, I think it was about a £250,000 jackpot that was rolling in at the top of the slot machine as a progressive jackpot. So they do it in a more subtle way. And I said earlier on that the triggers for me often are those kind of things, seeing slot machines that I've played on. And one last point, I know it's sort of jumping away from this subject, but on advertising, I was sat in the car the other day and an advert came on from a gambling company. This was on my way to the Sporting Chance office, and so it was in the morning, before 9 o'clock, and an advert came on for a specific slot, that basically, if you don't gamble on online slots, you would not have a clue what this advert was all about. It said the name of the slot is back on our website, a new version of it or whatever, come and do this. And it almost felt like that advert was just aimed at me, because most of the public have got no idea. It wasn't like, and it's not even something that's, there are slots like Deal or No Deal, which everyone would recognise the name. It wasn't one like that. It was like something that is literally just an online slots game. So I think there's a real problem with these casino games that have been moved online. And I think sometimes on both sides, when they talk about online gambling per se, it kind of just takes away from the real problems in that area.
Mm-hmm. So just on that note then, just to pick your brains, I suppose, just get your opinion, if you're happy to share it, what would you, in an ideal world, what would you like to see? How do you see the landscape changing in 5 years? Where would you like to see us to sort of, get to, as it were?
It's a very, very difficult question, because I don't want to, honestly, will hold my hands up and say that I don't know. I don't know the answers, because I'm not a technology expert. I don't know how they can be regulated. There are people who've done, spent their professional life doing research into these kind of things. There are people that have spent their professional life looking at the psychology of the gambling addicts themselves, the people that have this problem, and how they interact with those things. I personally, what I would say is that I have got several things in place to stop me from getting to that point, in addition to the kind of creating the life that I want to live. I use safety nets as well, just in case, but I do think that something needs to be done. That I went on slot machines online, as I said, I'd go on one website, lose everything in my bank account, maybe get some access to money, and a few days later, having self-excluded from that website, go into another one, lose everything on there. No checks, no intervention, never ever had an intervention. The only time I've ever had an intervention in my life in gambling was once in an actual casino, where the manager spoke to me, and that's the only time that's ever happened in my gambling life. And every time that I've wanted to self-exclude or raise that I had a problem, it's me that's started the conversation about that. And I just think it's just I don't know what does need to be done. And I think I'm going to be honest about this. I think the gambling industry have had long enough to do it, and don't seem to be showing the appetite to do it, because they don't seem to acknowledge certain aspects of the problem. So often it's about individual websites having their own toolkits, having their own safety nets. We promote safe gambling and all this kind of thing, but then actually the products that are, I think, the most dangerous, and many people agree on that, are still there. Effectively no limits, because they might have a very high limit, but if the limit's £100 a spin, even, there are some that are meant much more than that, but £100 a spin, and they're spinning every 2 seconds, effectively it's no limits, isn't it? And just the way those games are designed certainly is to exploit addiction. And I just think, again, I'm not giving you the answer to the question, because I'll hold my hands up. I don't know what the answer is. But I'm not an advocate generally of banning everything. I'm not an anti-gambling person. I'm not even an anti-gambling advertising person. I wouldn't even go as far as some people suggesting there. But if there's a product that is proven to be, and I think there needs to be clear independent research into this, it's proven to be as dangerous as, say, like, there are some alcohol's legal, but alcohol's a drug. But there are other drugs that are deemed to be more harmful than alcohol that are illegal. So the same thing could be applied to gambling. And one of the solutions that I've thought of in the past is perhaps banding different categories of things online. So you've kind of got, certain things that fall into a category that might be classed as, when people make this comparison, I'm waffling, sorry, but I'm trying to get to the point. When people make this comparison and they say you can't compare gambling to drugs because drugs are illegal and gambling's not, actually they forget that alcohol's a drug, it's just a legal one. So it already exists, this system, with other addictive products. So why not have the same applied to gambling? And if something is found to be as harmful as Class A drugs, or at that end of the scale, then maybe those products should be banned. And I think that, again, I'm not an advocate of banning things, but at least until they can make them safer, take them off the market completely.
No, definitely. I think, I think that's a very valid point. Very valid point. I think, if we can make gambling safer. I mean, I think the thing for me that you raised there was about the intervention. Myself was a big casino goer, and it's no coincidence that the only time that I got asked, to leave the tables, was the day that I actually self-excluded. I mean, strange coincidence or what, I'm not too sure. But yeah, for me, my opinion, I think more intervention needs to happen. How you go about that, like Richard said in his podcast, it's a grey area because, you know, it is other betting companies going to want to intervene if it's a high money making consumer, if you like. But yeah, how do you actually intervene safely and say the right thing at the right time to a person that's having clearly gambling problems, you know? And obviously the data is there online as well. So
yeah, and I think just on the back of that, the times when I did engage in conversation myself, I brought about a conversation, because sometimes, I know it's not as difficult now, but sometimes it was quite hard to self-exclude. It wasn't easy to find the bit. Now with GamStop, that's been an absolute blessing for someone like me to be able to do it all at the click of a button. But I think sometimes when I had these conversations, the kind of brutality of the engagement was often, I've lost a lot of money. I want to self-exclude from your site, and they can see the data, they can see how much I've lost, they can see how quickly I've lost it. And yet the response I always got was, okay, your account is now closed and you are self-excluded, and then just immediately be frozen out. So yeah, some people would argue that they don't have a duty of care, but generally it's accepted that they do. If that's the kind of engagement that's going on, I mean, that's shocking, isn't it? Who knows what I'm going to do from that point? And one thing I think that finally I would like to say, a point that hasn't come up, I'm sure it's come up in many of your podcasts, but I think I'd like to just say it as well, is I'm not a massive fan. I know I've made the comparison between the products. I'm not a massive fan of comparing addictions and trying to sort of say that the one that I suffer from is one that worse than one that somebody else suffers from. In fact, I know a lot of people that have gone, harrowing tales from other addictions, and really inspirational people that have turned their lives around as well. But what I would say is the mental health impact on someone who is a gambler, particularly online, because of the amount of damage it can do in such a short period of time. Most of my relapses have lasted probably a couple of days, and I've completely emptied my bank account, put myself under a huge financial and emotional pressure, and it's had a massive mental health impact. So you go from feeling pretty comfortable in life to feeling suicidal so fast. It's no surprise that it's got a higher suicide rate than any other addiction. And I just think that needs to be taken into consideration as well when people make these comparisons to, like, well, you can't blame the barman for selling drink to the alcoholic, but how much could the alcoholic drink £2,000 worth of alcohol, in his local pub, and would he feel suicidal at the end of that binge? It's often a longer period. And again, I'm falling into the trap of making the comparison myself, and people, literally die from substance abuse. But just the mental health impact, the speed of harm that happens in gambling is also something that needs to be looked at. And these slot machines online that we're talking about are really where slots and other casino games are really where that speed of harm is experienced.
So Chris, if we could move things on a little bit more. So obviously you work in sports journalism, you had a job, you said, sports management. So is this what then you wanted to do? Have you always wanted to be a darts commentator, and how did that come about?
Yeah, I always wanted to be a commentator, actually. It's strange. Most little kids want to be footballers, and I wanted to be a football commentator. Probably by the age of 4, I realised that I wasn't very good at football. But I was always a bit of a performer, always a kind of like the class clown character, the type of person to try and make people laugh. As a little kid, even, I would be getting up and telling jokes to adults because I really liked that sort of, I craved attention. I craved that buzz of other people's reactions, and I wanted to be loved, basically. Who doesn't? And things like playing football, I would commentate when I was playing football. I would commentate when I was playing on FIFA or Football Manager and things like that. So I knew pretty young that I wanted to be either a writer or a commentator. And I was on course to try and achieve that dream. When I was at college, I applied for a sports journalism course at university. And obviously, as I said, I got thrown out. But then 6 years later, was able to reapply as a mature student I got a good degree in sports journalism, got a job while I was at uni. Actually, it was another blessing because I don't think if I'd been at uni at 18, I would have handled it in the same way as I did when I was 23, with the life experience I'd had at that time. So it all sort of worked out good in the end in that sense. But yeah, about halfway through, I got given a chance. Someone took a chance on me. A guy called Jason Tame, who runs a sports management company called Modus, which is not far away from you. It's based in Waterlooville. And at the time, they'd signed a player called Michael van Gerwen, and within a year of me starting and him signing, he'd won the world championship and was world number one. So
there's no coincidence there.
yeah, exactly. No, but I'd kind of make the point to say, like, isn't it strange that I stopped gambling and I started having a lot of luck?
It is weird, isn't it? Mm-hmm. It is weird. It's like I don't know why this springs to mind, but it's like when you're when you've got a girlfriend, it seems easier to attract women. I don't know if it's the same thing, with the gambling and the luck.
I have to be careful there. I hope that isn't in the next room, Alex.
Yeah, I might have to cut this bit out.
Yeah, and then from there, it just became. Obviously, I was in that sport then. I was on the other side of the fence of journalism. It was more PR and press officer role. But then started doing little bits. Just little opportunities started coming my way. And then they started streaming events, streaming the events that sort of played behind closed doors. And I put my name forward to be tried as a commentator, got given the opportunity by the PDC. And that was about 4 years ago. So yeah, I'm still doing that. I do the European Tour and the Pro Tour events. Again, got lucky last year at the World Championship, was able to commentate for TalkSport on the radio because one of the other commentators, my good friend Paul Nicholson, lost his voice. So I stepped in for him for a game or two. I've written articles for national newspapers as well. So just really, really grateful to be doing work in an area that I love. And as we'll go on to talk about, it's now more than one area that I love because I do the work with Sporting Chance as well.
That's brilliant. And I know I've asked you this before, and whilst I'm still in a silly mood, so are you the guy, just to clarify, you're not the guy on the side of the stage saying, 180, you're the one in the box, commentating on it.
Yeah, so I'm the one that's probably ruining everyone's enjoyment by talking all over what they can see, rather than the guy that's adding to it by shouting. He's the caller, and I'm the commentator.
Ah, there we go. I was going to say, I've always wanted to go to the darts and stuff, and Ali Pali looks like an absolute ball. I'd love to go there. Where do you kind of end up going? I mean, obviously you said Europe and things, but can you go anywhere around the UK? Are there some venues that you kind of, your regular stop-off points and stuff like that?
Yeah, Ali Pali is brilliant. I've worked there for the last few years. Obviously, there's a couple of commentary matches for TalkSport last year, but I've worked for the PDC there for the last few years, helping writing articles for their website. But also, getting around Europe. So Prague was one of my favourite venues. We'd spend a lot of time in Germany. Darts is really big in Germany. Belgium, and I actually did go to Australia and New Zealand with the darts as well. When I was still working for the management company, I went there with Michael van Gerwen. They have a thing called the World Series when they go to different parts of the world with like the top 8 players. So it's becoming a global sport. It's actually much more popular than people think because it doesn't get the coverage it probably deserves from the mainstream media. But very often it's the second most watched sport on Sky behind football.
Wow.
So it's really, really popular, yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. So what's it like then? Obviously, being a commentator in the darts, and I don't know, I don't want to get too political as it were, but what's it like, there's obviously it's sponsored by a lot of gambling industry companies and things like that. And how do you feel about that as a recovering gambling addict, that you're surrounded by sort of betting adverts and things like that?
Good question, and it's something that I've given a lot of thought to myself, not least because I was having a lot of relapses, and although I didn't think, and still probably don't think it was affecting me, I don't think it was causing the relapses, should I say. But it got to the point where I started thinking maybe do I need a career change? Maybe am I not able to work in this environment? Actually, to be fair, It has only really been the last few years where we've seen every tournament, not just in darts, but in most sports, be sponsored by gambling companies. But everyone's different. And I think for me, I'm very lucky that the people that I work with are very, very supportive. I've never been asked to speak about odds. I've never been asked as a commentator to mention the odds for a match or anything like that, even though when we stream live events, it's a subscription service that I work for, but also those matches will be streamed on bookmakers' websites. And that's been a moral dilemma for me at times, but I think I settled on the idea that I'm not directly getting money from gambling companies, so therefore why should I give up on my dream because they happen to be the ones that are paying the most money for the sponsorship that I've got absolutely no control over. So I think the answer to your question is me personally. You asked a question about triggers earlier. I don't feel particularly triggered by seeing a gambling sponsor's name on a stage. Where I do feel triggered is when I watch an advert, or hear an advert even on the radio, where it's making reference to a specific slot machine that I've played, and I can see the jackpot rolling in, or I can see the roulette ball spinning around, and that kind of gets me going and does trigger me, and that's when I have to deal with it. But just for me, I'm kind of all right with it sort of being, I'm able to make it background when it's just on a stage or on an advertising hoarding, or it's a bookmaker's in the street, you know what I mean? It's just there and I kind of don't see it anymore.
Yeah.
So that's, and because the people that I work with are fantastic about it, you know, they don't talk about gambling around me. They don't ask me to talk about gambling. I think that I'm a better commentator because I don't, you know, I dread to think what I would have been like if I'd have been gambling on darts and commentating on darts. You know, it would have been a very different experience for me and the viewers. But because I've got no sort of investment in that way, I think that makes me, you know, much more impartial and probably better. But I'm a better sports viewer anyway. I can watch a football match and enjoy it. And I think there's a great, what happened to having an opinion on something without then being told to put your money where your mouth is or whatever, you know? What happened? When did that change? And I like the fact that I'm able to have an opinion and not have to sort of back it up by saying, oh yeah, but if you'd have put a tenner on that, you'd have won 100 quid. Yeah, so what?
No, exactly. I don't know if you saw listened to. Did you listen to Max Rushton's podcast this week? I don't know if I
did. Yeah, I thought it was excellent.
What a brilliant
barring
podcast.
Some bits, yeah. Barring well, maybe we'll come on to this, but barring again, I'm talking about advertising in sport. And I think there are things that, again, people are triggered by different things. So I'm not claiming to know the answers. I'm not claiming to know any of the answers, let alone all of them. But for someone to go on there, like the chair of the betting and gaming council, to say that because of this whistle-to-whistle ban, as they call it, children don't see gambling adverts during live football. I mean, how can someone say that? They weren't challenged on it. That was my only criticism of the whole podcast. How can they say that when actually, they're not? The only time they're not allowed to advertise effectively is half time, and there are sponsors on the shirts around the stadium throughout the whole match. And I'm not even saying whether I agree with that or not. I'm just saying to say that they don't see those adverts during a football match is a complete lie.
Yeah, no, I was going to say, I think I saw something. Oh, I think it was with Clean Up Gambling. I think they made a statement, or there was a picture recently of a girl that is a West Ham supporter, and she's called her Teddy Betway, which was pretty alarming. But no, on the whole, I thought it was a really good podcast, and I thought
it was very good.
Yeah, a really good listen, really good listen.
Unfortunately, we're going to subject the same kinds of people to this one after Alex. So that will have me rambling on.
So how did the chance with Sporting Chance come along?
I see what you did there. Very good. Basically, it was born out of. I've been quite public about my experiences. Obviously, you saw the video of the NHS clinic. I'm a great friend of the NHS clinic as well. I think Matt Gaskell and the people there do fantastic work. And the more I've got into recovery, the more that I start to sort myself out, or that, you know, I've accepted the help. I think it's important to say one of the big observations that I've got of life, actually, not just recovery, is that nobody can do it alone. You know, anyone who's had any measure of success was given a chance somewhere, was given help somewhere. And I've got an incredible support system. And the more that I reflect on that, the more I think that I want to put something back into that area. So I've always sort of wanted to do this. And I don't know if this is something you experience, but it's amazing the amount of opportunities that just seem to present themselves when you kind of do the right things. And I didn't really chase it. I just knew it was something that I wanted to do. It was always sort of in my heart and in my mind to do something in the area of addiction and mental health, in whatever form that may take, whether it meant training as a counsellor or doing education sessions or just some form of lived experience sharing. And when I was about 9 months, I'd say, a good friend of mine now at the PDPA, Peter Manley, he put me in touch with a guy called Alex Mills at Sporting Chance. Firstly, just to see how I was getting on, because he knew, my situation, and they were a partner of the Professional Darts Players Association. And we had a few chats, and Alex was really good about, he liked what I had to say, heard my story. And Sporting Chance sort of have been good to me as well, and didn't straight away actually say, can you come and work for us? Because they've got certain protocols in place where people should be a certain amount of time off their addiction before they go and do any work, but just kept now and again checking in and speaking to me. And I went and did a story. I went and shared my story at a football club, because that's part of what they do. So their education sessions are a combination of education around gambling, specifically around thoughts and feelings, the mindset of people who may develop unhealthy relationships, challenging people to see where they are really on the spot. Are there someone who doesn't gamble? Are there someone who gambles a bit but doesn't have a problem? Are there someone who might have a problem? Are there someone like me who's got a full-blown addiction? And that's developed over time as well to take into account other factors like the danger of the products, the harmful products that are out there, like external factors like advertising, and making people understand the environment that they're in. We don't have the power to change it, but we can help people understand it. And I shared my story, that went well, and ended up being recruited to help to be part of the education team. So I went from sharing my story to actually facilitating sessions about education. And then more recently, they asked me if I would like the role as communications manager, based on obviously the experience that I've got in that area. So it's all come together very nicely. I'm doing the Darts Commentary, which I absolutely love, and then working in another area that really means a lot to me, and I'm able to use my skills and experience to do the best I can in that role.
That's great. That's great. I mean, yeah, I definitely agree with the whole sort of, opportunities that present themselves. Once you kind of come out and, you're honest with the world, you're honest with yourselves, you're honest with the world. No, that's absolutely brilliant. It's a great story, basically, that you've, been able to sort of turn your life around, and yeah, it's brilliant. It's inspiring.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know, and one thing I would say, I know we're probably going to go and talk about some of the Sporting Chance stuff rather than just about me. I don't want it to all be about me. But one thing I would say is, if I can do it, I've just shared that I've gambled every day for 6 years, that I couldn't seem to stay stopped, kept having relapses. I believe that anyone is capable of doing it. I also believe it requires a lot of courage. It requires a lot of help. You know what I mean? But I just think there is hope for everyone. And it's an important message to put out, because as much as we can often rightly criticise the gambling industry or criticise the government or all the many things that go into contributing to somebody going through the horrific experience of gambling addiction, often an avoidable experience for a lot of people. I think it's important to say, there is also help out there. There is also hope out there, even in the current environment, So I just encourage anyone who is going through it, if they're listening to this, and Alex, it's a fantastic service, because I know that when I was in the throes of addiction, I'd often listened to podcasts or to anything that was out there. There wasn't as many of them, but anything like this might inspire me to get a little bit of help. So you know what? If one person can do that as a result of this podcast, then we've done our job.
Absolutely. No, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. So, so this week, obviously, there's been a BBC Sport website article with Tony Tony Adams, founder of Sporting Chance, and Colin Bland, CEO, his open letter. So let's hear a little bit more about that. So Tony Adams has said that gambling is now the biggest issue, or for people that they see, for people that you see at Sporting Chance. Has that been on like a steady rise for the last sort of few years?
Yeah, so just to clarify, it's the biggest issue in terms of people that we see
yes.
With addictive disorders. Usually the biggest issue is around low mood, because we're not just an addiction treatment service. We provide treatment for any mental health condition with the mental health people, for professional sports people. So, but in terms of the population of people who have addictive disorders, or problems that often lead to addictive disorders, gambling has become the majority issue, and it has. I mean, the figures are based on the last 3 years there, and that's been the case for the last 3 years, and it's been a steady rise for the last 3 years. But before that, I mean, alcohol and other substances were predominantly the biggest issue when the clinic was set up, and had been for a long time in terms of addiction. So it's certainly been a changing picture, and it's changed quite. Even though it's been a steady rise for the last 3 years, it kind of changed quite quickly before that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. So, going back one step, so also it's founded by Tony Adams. I mean, it's actually just based up the road from me here in Portsmouth at a place called Liphook up the A3,
yeah.
and I regularly just sort of drive past it, just grab a Starbucks just off at the services. But so tell us more about the actual the treatment that the Sporting Chance clinic provides. So it's residential. Am I right in saying that?
It's twofold. There's a residential clinic, the one that you've just spoken about near your local Starbucks, and there's also a therapy network. As for some people, therapy alongside other advised things like support group meetings, mutual aid meetings, professional therapy will be a good start, and maybe enough for them to overcome whatever it is they need to overcome. For people that are suffering more severely with addiction, there's a rehab facility, the one that you talked about, and that is a place where people can go for sort of more intensive treatment to start with, and then they would go out into the world, but continue with the therapy network after that.
Yeah, and how does it work in terms of like, so if I'm a pro sports player, can I just sort of almost like contact Sporting Chance direct and just say, look, I've got some problems and I'd like to sort them out. How does that work? Is it just as simple as like a phone call?
Yeah, there are different setups with different sports, but Sporting Chance serves several sports, and basically it is a case of picking up the phone. The sportsman, it's a fully confidential service answered by trained professionals in the triage team, who will then help place the sports person with the right treatment for whatever mental health problem that may be.
That's brilliant. And I mean, again, what sports are we seeing? I mean, because of Tony Adams' background with football, I just naturally just think of football. I mean, I had George Paris on the podcast, a former West Ham player, podcast 2, if anyone wants to listen to it. Shameless plug. But he used Sporting Chance. And so I mean, are you okay to talk about the people that you see? I mean, I don't know if I'm delving into sort of confidential information and stuff like that, but is it just footballers? Is that the biggest amount of people that you see, or is it rugby? Is it cricket? Is it athletics? That kind of thing?
Obviously couldn't talk about the people, confidentiality, but also it's confidential from me anyway. I don't work in the treatment side of the business, right, so okay. I wouldn't know who went into treatment, but we've got stakeholders in football, the Premier League. We've got stakeholders in rugby, in darts, obviously the PDPA, which I mentioned, jockeys, cricket, tennis, squash, you name it, many sports that we've got partnerships with. And that is not just, again, the area that I work in. We're talking about Sporting Chance Clinic as a treatment provider, but the area I work in is education. We also provide education. about mental health and addiction to all of these stakeholder sports as well.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know. Would you like to maybe spend some time talking about like what you do as an education, as a get your words out, as an educator facilitator? Is that correct? Is that the title?
I would say education facilitator.
There we go. Yeah, thank you. I was going to say I was going to say I need, the grammar police. I'm forever spell checking things on Word. Yeah.
Yeah, there's not a spell check for a spoken word, is there? Unfortunately,
no.
Yeah, but basically, so yeah, we'll go out to clubs and sporting organisations and share education seminars. Obviously, at the moment, the majority of that is online. It's our preference to be in the clubs, to be in the organisations, sharing those on many different topics related to mental health, including addiction. My specialism, obviously, is gambling, so that's where I spend most of my time delivering education seminars. You'll probably be pleased to know that in terms of the gambling education, we're not a fan of the responsible gambling narrative. That's not something that we promote. We don't take funding from any organisations that contribute or that we believe contribute to the mental health of our client population, which includes but is not limited to gambling organisations. So we're independent. We deliver education, we deliver treatment, and very important, I think, particularly the work that we do with younger players to just enlighten them a little bit, get them to question themselves, their own behaviour. As I said, when I was a young person, actually a lot of the signs for an impending addiction were there, but also to make them aware of the environment as well. As I said, the environment, although it may change slowly, will not change overnight. So it's very important to make people aware of the environment that we're in, not just in sport actually, but as a society. So we can actually make more informed decisions rather than, I think, it might have been the podcast that we discussed before, rather than that sort of expectation that, you have to gamble, that gambling is something that everybody does, because it's really not.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I saw a stat recently. I shared it on Instagram. It was like professional sports people are 3 times more likely to be problem gamblers than the general population. And it's interesting because I got released from a professional club at 16, having been there for, I think, 8 years, at Oxford United, and that had a massive impact on me. And talking about understanding your triggers and leading a kind of fulfilling life, and I had to really dig deep, and actually for 10 years that bothered me. And I wonder, without fully knowing, or probably will never know, but I wonder if the gambling was a subliminal thing that I was trying to get away from, and if it was the sort of the addiction to winning, and always, okay, don't worry about a loss, it's about the next win, the competitive spirit. But yeah, that bugged me for 10 years. I'm not exaggerating to say every single day of the year, I would think about this release. I don't know. It was just the whole kind of what if, and it's interesting because I'm a member of Now We Win, which is a kind of an exercise support group for people like wanting to beat gambling addiction. And it's interesting because in that group, again, without kind of breaching confidentiality too much, but there are some other people that have a very similar story to myself. So keep up the good work. Yeah, sounds brilliant.
So on the sporting chance, obviously, the next thing, I'm sure you probably want to come on to that anyway, was the open letter that you mentioned. And I'd be happy to stick around. I know we've been about an hour, but I'd be happy to stick around and answer any questions that you might have on that as well.
I was going to say, well, we are doing a bonus episode, so
yeah, I'm not sure that how many people will see it as a bonus, but they've heard enough about me.
Well, I mean, I don't know. Are you okay for should we say like another 10 minutes or something?
Yeah, that'd be absolutely fine.
That's cool. So I don't know. I'll take your lead on this. I mean, what would you like to kind of to cover? So I mean, Colin Bland has said that the relationship between sport and gambling has reached a pivotal point, quote unquote. He's labelled gambling addiction as, again, quote unquote, a serious public health issue, and he's also called for meaningful reform. So I don't know if you want to kind of tell us more about that.
Yeah, I think first of all, there's Sporting Chance has not very often spoken publicly about issues. As I said, fundamentally, our primary purpose is to be there as a treatment provider and an education provider for professional sports people, and that's what we've done for a very long time. I think it became apparent to Colin and the team at Sporting Chance that actually there was a problem here, that there was a rise in a certain area that was affecting our client population, and that there were legitimate concerns to be raised with our stakeholders about the relationship between gambling and sport. And we're not just talking about football. Often a lot of the conversations are about football, but I think it's also pointed out very well by Colin in his letter that I think each sport needs to kind of come to their own solution, because the relationship with gambling is very different for some sports than it is with football. The survival possibility without it is very different. But that's the essence of the problem, really. The situation where we're dealing with people that have become dependent on gambling, who may then be going back to sporting environments where the sport itself is dependent on gambling. And that's a very difficult thing for us. I think there's a concern that Colin raised in the letter about, potentially a very conceivable situation where a sports person comes into treatment at Sporting Chance, does everything right, really, and takes on board all the stuff that is suggested and all that kind of thing, but then returns to quite dangerous environment for his or her addiction. So I think, first of all, it's an acknowledgement of the problem. And the first thing that Sporting Chance want to do is simply just have a conversation, just maybe get people within sports to think about this relationship, and just maybe share some of the stats that we've shared and get them to look at that and think, is this what we want? And start that conversation and have a sensible conversation about, actually, if it's not what you want, then how do we move away from that? Because in the current climate, it probably is true that it might not be the most responsible thing to just pull the rug from under the feet of the sports immediately overnight, because then we'd be dealing with another set of mental health issues at our clinic. And obviously we don't want to be part of kind of the thing that brought that about. Also, there may be changes in legislation anyway. The government may change and actually ban advertising or something. So important, perhaps, the sport to have a plan B anyway, the sports that have become dependent on gambling, because the government could pull the rug from under their feet overnight. And then if they've not already got a plan in place to move away from these associations, then that could be damaging to the sport too. So it's our priority at Sporting Chance to have a healthier sporting population, a healthier sport, so that the people in the sport are in a healthier environment. And there are a couple of things that have been suggested in Colin's letter. So the first, as I say, is to start the conversation. The second is, in the short to medium term, to ensure that social responsibility funds are being used properly. So the suggestion is that while gambling sponsorship still exists, that effectively a mandatory levy within sport from every single sponsorship deal that is signed within sport, that a percentage of that goes to the governing body of that sport, specifically to help protect against gambling harms in whatever form they decide is fit, rather than the gambling operators themselves actually choosing where treatment comes from, where education comes from, in some cases providing that themselves, and potentially pushing a sort of incompatible, responsible gambling narrative onto those sports. We believe in an independent, safe space. We believe we are an independent, safe space, but we certainly believe there should be an option for people to have that as well. And in the long term, the kind of ultimate long-term advice and goal would to be to wean those sports that have become dependent on gambling off that dependency, to reduce, to put in place a long-term plan to reduce and replace gambling associations, because it is something that is increasingly showing up as being a very, very unhealthy relationship and has a great impact on the mental health of the clients that we see.
Absolutely. I think, it is so intertwined. I don't really know what to say, Chris. I'm actually lost for words for once.
It's a shame I wasn't. I'm aware that people, they might not want to listen to me prattling on for an hour and 10 minutes, but But I just really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk. And it always actually does me good to share my own story. It's almost a therapeutic exercise in itself. But also the opportunity to come on and share about the stuff with Sporting Chance, I think, is a really good platform. There are a lot of people doing excellent work in this area. You're one of them. And again, we don't think at Sporting Chance we've got all the answers. We're talking about starting a conversation in the very niche area that we're in. But actually, often sport can be a reflection of wider society. And if sport can get things right, then maybe there's hope for the rest of society to sort of not be as exposed as well, because even though one of our concerns is the environment that sports people that have been in treatment are going back to, that environment also exists for sports fans ultimately, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I think that's a really good place to finish, actually. I think that's a really strong message, and hopefully the conversation carries on. And yeah, this is the start of, as you say, just starting a conversation and moving things forward. I think that'd be amazing. So Chris, is there anything else that you want to mention before we kind of wrap things up?
No, I think I've talked enough. Just thanks to you for having me on. You've started many a conversation yourself, so well done on your podcast series, and enjoy your well-deserved break until the next run.
Thanks very much, Chris, and I'll speak to you soon. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm. Thanks.
I'd like to say a massive thank you once again to Chris for giving up his time to share his story with us. Plenty of takeaways from the conversation. Firstly, and I don't know about you, but I found Chris's story to be incredibly moving. It wasn't easy listening to Chris's suicide attempt. And once again, I'd like to emphasise how many people, around one per day in the UK, take their own life because of gambling. Chris's powerful and inspiring story proves that you can turn your life around from gambling addiction and realise your potential. In Chris's case, starting university and fulfilling his dream to be a darts commentator. Whilst Chris mentioned how anyone can beat gambling addiction, we must emphasise the importance of getting help and support. Please visit the Invisible Addiction website for support networks available in the UK. I would agree that online casino games are incredibly addictive and dangerous, causing huge amount of harm in a short space of time, not only financially, but the rapid downward spiral on your mental health. It's concerning to hear about Sporting Chance's statistics that over 50% of sports people they see for treatment are for gambling problems and low mood. I would like to think that sport would lead the way for the rest of society and reduce its dependency on gambling. Hopefully the conversation continues and we can see a positive change in the future for the good of society. Thank you for listening to the podcast. I'll be back soon with Series 3. In the meantime, please look out for vlogs on YouTube. I'll be chatting about my own experiences with gambling addiction, and I hope that they will be relatable for you. All right, take care, guys, and speak soon. Ta-da.